Okay, good evening all. Thank you all for being here this evening for our webinar presenting the findings of CA's recently completed climate vulnerability assessment. My name is Jeremy Scharfenberg and I am the Director of Sustainability for the Columbia Association, and I will be helping to facilitate the presentation this evening. This project represents an important piece of CA's continued leadership in environmental issues such as climate change and watershed stewardship. And we are really excited to present these findings and help inform the community on these very important and pressing issues, perhaps one of the most important issues of our time, in fact. Your presenters this evening include our President and CEO, Lakey Boyd, the Chair of CA's Climate Change and Sustainability Advisory Committee, Tim Lattimer, and a team of consultants from Michael Baker International that completed the study for the Columbia Association. And so to kick things off, we'll have Lakey Boyd provide some opening remarks. Take it away, Lakey.
Okay, hello everyone, good evening. I'm excited to see we have many participants already, right as we're getting started with the evening. It's clear to me that you two agree that this is an important topic, and I couldn't agree more with Jeremy's opening comments. As everyone here likely knows, but just as a reminder, Columbia Association has been a steward of our open space, our land, our facilities for more than 50 years, but a lot has changed over that time. And particularly the world around us, the climate, the weather, the temperatures, the rain, and all of those projections are that it's going to continue to change, and most likely on a much more accelerated pace than we have even experienced. So organizations like ours that are not only significant landowners, but really take our stewardship, protection, and respect of the land, as well as how do we do that in a sustainable way. I really want to applaud our team, which obviously Jeremy was a lead in, and our advisory committee. This is one committee that is very active and also has a lot of expertise that we're able to leverage from our volunteers in the community, and really taking a step in leadership for doing this climate vulnerability assessment and understanding what these potential impacts are going to be on more than 500 assets kind of across our community, across Columbia. So I just want to celebrate that we're taking this step, that we are really a progressive leader in thinking forward about how we're going to continue to steward in a long-term way, in a multi-generational way, our community resources. So I want to thank the consultant team. I want to thank the CA staff led by Jeremy and the sustainability team, and Tim and the committee for getting us here this evening. And very excited, I'll stay tuned in to hear the details. I've seen the report on how we're going to position to improve Columbia's resilience for the long term. So thank you for being here tonight.
Great. Thanks very much, Lakey. And now I'd like to go through just some quick logistics as we get into the heart of the presentation. So this is a Zoom webinar, which means the presenters are the only ones on camera. So all the other participants at the moment, the other 70, I guess the other 74 participants in total. So the bulk of the participants are observers only. We are using the Q&A function to sort of serve as a feedback loop for the session. So viewers are welcome to submit questions as the presentation goes along. I will be serving as a moderator, trying to track it and manage the input as that comes in. And you can submit those questions anonymously or with your name as well. Please do not use the chat for submitting questions. Please stick with the Q&A tool for that purpose. Following the consultant's presentation, a little wrap up by Tim, we will be holding about a 15-minute Q&A. We're going to try to hold the bulk of the questions and answers to the end of the session. If there are some particularly prescient questions that I feel are fairly relevant as a moderator, I may interject the speaker or interrupt the speaker to interject a particular question, but we're going to try to save the bulk of the Q&A towards the end just to keep the flow moving. And also this presentation, this webinar is focused on CA's climate change vulnerability assessment and the findings of that work. Please refrain from submitting questions that may be on other topics. This is not a forum for questions on the number of swim lanes we have active in the community, and that's another big topic. The big topic is lap lanes, right? That's another webinar, not this one. Climate vulnerability. So please stay on topic with your questions. And so with that, I will turn it over to Tim Lattimer, who is the chair of the Climate Change and Sustainability Advisory Committee, which played a key role in moving this project forward. Take it away, Tim.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy, and thank you, Lakey, for your kind opening remarks. On behalf of the Climate Change and Sustainability Advisory Committee for CA, I really do want to thank everybody for joining us here tonight. And I want to thank CA for its leadership on these issues. In particular, our committee is really grateful to CA staff, the sustainability team, and really everybody in CA for their outstanding support and engagement on these issues, especially Jeremy Scharfenberg. And we also very much appreciate the support of the CA board, and especially the board's vice chair, Ginny Thomas, who spearheaded the board's original creation of our committee and whose active and ongoing engagement and support for our work as the board liaison to our committee has really been tremendous. Our committee includes about a dozen volunteers whose ranks include engineers, ecologists, educators, planners, and sustainability experts. Most importantly, though, we are your neighbors and we share your concerns about our community. And we are here because climate change is real, it's already happening, and it's bringing with it more extreme heat and precipitation events that can threaten the health and well-being of Columbia. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is a UN body that brings together thousands of scientists and experts from around the world. In their 6th assessment report released last August, they concluded that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the planet by about 1.9 degrees Fahrenheit since the start of the industrial age. And this is caused primarily by the combustion of fossil fuels and the loss of forests, both of which put enormous volumes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which, together with other gases like methane, intensify the greenhouse effect that warms the planet. Last year was the 6th warmest year on record. And the 7 hottest years that we have experienced in the modern era have all occurred over the last 7 years. That's a trend, not a coincidence. And so we've already seen the costly results that come with extreme rainfall events, prolonged heat waves, sea level rise, and other consequences related to a changing climate. The scientific community has warned that if left unchecked, these trends could render parts of the Earth uninhabitable later this century and yield catastrophic results for human beings and the rest of the natural world. As the UN Secretary General put it, the IPCC's most recent report is a code red alert for humanity. And if we're to avoid the worst impacts, we'll need to make deep reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2030, with still more reductions to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. That's both a great challenge and a great opportunity to transform our economy into one that's cleaner, greener, more competitive, and more resilient. CA has been at the forefront in tackling this challenge, thanks to the great work of folks like Jeremy and others on CA staff over the past decade. The Columbia Association has achieved major gains in energy efficiency and clean energy deployment, cutting CA's greenhouse gas emissions significantly. In addition, CA's board had the foresight to adopt a resolution in late 2019 to recognize a climate emergency and to advocate regarding emergency mobilization efforts to help restore a safe climate. Among other things, that resolution set in motion efforts aimed at enabling CA to achieve net zero emissions no later than 2040. It also called for putting in place climate adaptation and resilience measures to avoid or reduce the impacts of climate change on CA infrastructure and open space resources. And it committed CA to strengthening community outreach and advocacy efforts to increase awareness of the Columbia community about the climate emergency and to help catalyze a climate mobilization effort to protect our community's safety and well-being. So in carrying this work forward, CA staff and the committee identified the need for a 30,000-foot planning level analysis to help the Columbia Association flag key vulnerabilities and concerns related to potential impacts that may result from the changes to the climate that we know are already unavoidable. The board asked our committee to work with CA staff and others in developing a climate vulnerability assessment, or CVA, that would help to identify key climate risks and provide a foundation for advancing future climate resiliency efforts in Columbia. So we worked closely with CA staff to develop and circulate a request for proposals for technical support services in areas such as modeling future climate scenarios and creating an online tool that would help to support CA's analysis of potential climate-related risks and hazards that would help to identify areas that might be vulnerable to climate change, and basically both for Columbia as a whole, as well as at the level of each village. So through a competitive bidding process, CA selected Michael Baker International to provide the support, as they had the requisite technical expertise as well as a solid understanding of the local context. So we're fortunate to have with us this evening some of Michael Baker's experts who are here tonight to walk us through their work that they carried out in close coordination with CA staff. I'm delighted to introduce Necolle Maccherone, who not only spearheaded this effort as Michael Baker's project manager, she's also a Columbia resident. So Necolle, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. That's a great introduction. I really appreciate it. And I echo what you and Lakey said during our introduction. Just a brief introduction of myself. Like Tim said, my name is Necolle Maccherone. I work for Michael Baker International, and I have a background in environmental science with a recent focus on risk communications. And I'm going to, along with my colleagues, share information about the climate vulnerability assessment. So I'll just pause here for a moment to get the slide deck running that we're going to use this evening. Okay, so as Tim has said, climate change has long been a topic of conversation, and for many years it was discussed as something that may happen in the future, although many have observed that it's happening now. And as a result, taking actions to protect existing assets and planning for future conditions is something that's important that we do now. So there are many scientific bodies of work and like the UN that Tim spoke about, and many governments that recognize that this work is essential for the health and long-term benefit of the built and natural environment. And the US is no exception. They have a law requiring research into global warming and related issues, known as the Fourth National Climate Assessment. This is a report that goes to Congress every 4 years that details the result of this investigation into global warming and related issues. And the most recent report shows that the northeastern United States, including Maryland, can expect more intense heat waves, rainfall, and a higher flood risk. From its beginning, Columbia has been forward-leaning in the area of inclusiveness, the natural environment, and community responsibility. CA has a strategic plan, and it uses this plan as a roadmap to accomplish actions that align with the mission, vision, and values of CA. So environmental sustainability is a priority in the plan, with the goal to advance Columbia as a leader in environmental sustainability in Maryland. And several steps are lined out to reach this goal, one of them being conducting a Columbia-wide climate vulnerability assessment to identify key climate risks affecting community assets. So a climate vulnerability assessment, in a nutshell, is an exercise that can be used as a tool in decision-making when considering adaptation and mitigation actions to reduce the impacts from climate change. It essentially lays the foundation to prepare for asset management. It looks at existing space and then uses data and predictions to provide insight on what may be at risk in the future. So as a nonprofit community services corporation, CA manages many areas of Columbia, home to approximately 100,000 people, including me. And they are responsible for the maintenance of many man-made lakes, ponds, parks, tot lots, pathways, community and neighborhood centers, outdoor pools, golf courses, tennis clubs, and more recreational amenities. So to better understand the climate change impacts to these assets and the Columbia community, CA worked with us to obtain the technical climate vulnerability assessment. And this assessment uses data and climate predictions to identify areas in our community that might be vulnerable for CA to take a closer look at for next steps. So we focused on increased precipitation, increased flood risk as a result of that precipitation, and extreme temperatures. The project team evaluated over 550 assets that are owned, maintained, or otherwise notable for CA. And the assets were categorized into types. You can see the various types here on the slide. And I'm going to hand the methodology section over to my colleague, Mike. And Mike, if you could just give us a brief introduction too, that would be great.
Thank you, Necolle. As Necolle said, my name's Mike Yaffe. I'm a resilience planner here at Michael Baker International. I have a background. I was the project manager for New Jersey's update for their state climate resilience strategy, and the manager of the Resilient New Jersey program, which was a $1.5 million HUD-funded regional resilience planning grant, which I'm happy to say was recently highlighted by the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, which was the methodology that we used to help inform this study. So the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit uses kind of 5 steps to resilience, which you can see on your screen here. 1, explore hazards. 2, assess vulnerability and risk. 3, investigate options. 4, prioritize and plan. And 5, take action. Next slide, please. And so as part of the study, we did an extensive review and inventory of the data out there. I'm not going to go through all the data on the screen, but I did want to note a few things. During the course of the review, we know that the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, the 10-year update to the County Master Plan, and the FEMA flood study for Howard County was underway concurrent to this study. We did find there was sufficient existing data to conduct the assessment. However, we did identify some data gaps. These included no existing future flood hazard or extreme heat mapping and no dam inundation mapping. To address the gaps, the team developed modeling for future increased precipitation and flooding, and we also suggested that future dam inundation mapping could support more detailed results. For extreme heat, we conducted a qualitative assessment. And as part of this process, we did do an extensive engagement process to make sure we weren't developing this product in a bubble. Engagement outside of Columbia Association occurred throughout the project. This helped us understand work underway and possible points of plan integration. So throughout the process, we met with the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, State FIP Coordinator, the Howard County Master Plan Update Team, the Howard County Environmental Sustainability Subcommittee, Climate Change and Sustainability Advisory Committee, the Maryland Hydrology Panel member, the Howard County Stormwater Management Division Coordinator, and we developed a comprehensive stakeholder feedback gathering tool, which you can see the tool on this slide. As part of the tool, we asked Columbia Association members of the village's watershed advisory committees, village boards, Columbia Association committees, Columbia Association staff, and other stakeholders to fill out a traditional survey and a web mapping tool to help locate areas that have been previously impacted by climate hazards. And as part of the process and study, we also mapped and looked at socially vulnerable populations. The data you see on the screen here has been developed by the CDC. We know this is important because climate change will disproportionately impact low-income communities, communities of color, and other socially vulnerable populations. Those experiencing poverty, older adults, linguistically isolated communities, recent immigrants, and other underrepresented communities have a limited ability to prepare for and cope with extreme weather and climate events, making them more vulnerable to these events. We know Columbia was founded on the inclusiveness of all races and socioeconomic statuses. By including data on socially vulnerable populations, Columbia Association can manage assets in a way that considers the impacts of climate change on vulnerable populations. Again, to evaluate stream temperature, the project team performed a qualitative assessment and considered how increased temperature is expected to impact the community's health and well-being, especially for socially vulnerable populations. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Katie Daly, who's going to highlight how we modeled precipitation and flooding events.
Thank you so much, Mike. And just brief intro about myself. I'm a water resources engineer with Michael Baker, but I also spend a good amount of my time with resilience planning as well. The Resilient New Jersey program that Mike mentioned before, I act as deputy project manager for that project, as well as the flood modeling lead. So going into evaluation of flooding exposure, and specifically flooding related to precipitation, your riverine related flooding. What we first did is we looked, okay, well, what data is available right now? As Mike mentioned, there were many resources that we looked through. And one of the first things that you'll look at when you look for flood data is the FEMA firm, your flood insurance rate map. And so we looked at that information, and typically your firm is going to present information based on your 100-year or 1% annual chance flood, as well as your 500-year or 0.2% chance flood. And that's current data. It doesn't look into the future. But unfortunately, what we found is when we reviewed the firms for Columbia, much of the data only showed the flood extents and not the depths. And so it was helpful information, but we were looking to do more. And so that's where we really got into the additional flood modeling that we performed for this project. And so what we have is essentially a two-dimensional HECRAS model that we can model on a watershed-based level. And it is a planning level model. So I do want to stress that. And really the goal of the model is to highlight Columbia's vulnerable areas. So it's not intended at the moment for site-specific analysis. It can be evolved for that, but it is intended to be planning level. To explain that, I guess, in a little bit more detail, something along the lines of specifics for a culvert or a bridge, drainage networks. Those weren't included in this model. They can be incorporated in the future. But again, the model is really intended, again, first to show those regional vulnerabilities, and it can be refined in the future for more site-specific information. But one thing that was great about these models is we could manipulate the inputs and see, what the flooding depths and extents would look like with changes in precipitation. And so we could look to see what these flood models would look like, what the flooding could look like, these vulnerabilities in the future. And again, these flood models were able to show us both flooding extents and depths. So that in hand with the information that we had from the FEMA firms were data that we utilized for flooding exposure for the study. And next slide. So then based on the information that we gathered, explained on the previous slides, we went through for the 550 plus assets within Columbia, and we ranked them all based on their relative risk. And so there were really two things that we looked at in terms of our risk ranking. And you'll see that this is a qualitative evaluation, exposure and vulnerability. So the one side is the exposure, and that's related to these climate hazards that we've been discussing. And then the other piece is is it a vulnerable asset? And so what made that asset vulnerable is, does it serve a vulnerable population? So that could be, again, deemed based on the asset type. So say a nursing home, or depending on the census tract, if it had a higher social vulnerability, then it would be deemed as serving a vulnerable population. Also assets that served an emergency need, something like a shelter. We also looked at infrastructure that maybe had a history of flooding or flooding complaints. So we utilized the data from both Howard County's flood complaint log, as well as the frequently flooded roadways data. And so that also, we utilized that to identify potentially vulnerable assets. And so using both the exposure and the vulnerability, we were able to determine, is that asset under low, medium, or high risk? And that's correlated to minimal impacts, moderate impacts, or high impacts from climate-related hazards. And so looking at the matrix, you can pretty quickly tell if an asset is both exposed and vulnerable, it's going to be identified as high risk. If it's one or the other, it would be identified as medium risk. And if it's neither, it's low risk. And next slide.
Thanks, Mike and Katie, for talking us through the methodologies. So how were our results? Of these 550 plus assets, overall, Columbia is very well positioned. We found that approximately 4% of the evaluated assets are high risk for future flooding, and all of these assets are footbridges or tot lots. Approximately 5% of the evaluated assets are high risk for extreme temperature. These include bridges, playgrounds, the sports park, and dog park. There were some other areas of concern along Columbia's footpaths where they may have intersected with future floodplains, and some other areas that we noted in the final report. So when we thought through, how well positioned Columbia was based on our analysis, some of the reasons that we thought we got the results that we did were in part due to the terrain or the topography of the area. The waterways in Columbia are very channelized and their banks are very steep. So this allows for the containment of a lot of the water that may result from the increased precipitation. And we also think a lot has to do with the thoughtful nature in which Columbia was planned. As one of the nation's first planned communities, development was largely placed on high ground, and open space and outdoor recreational areas were largely placed in the lower lying areas. So CA has been provided a final report and some outreach handouts with more details about the assessment process, results, and potential next steps. And the project team created this GIS tool, this online tool that Tim referenced earlier on, to understand the assessments and its results. So CA plans to put the products on their website at some point, and we are going to, and if Katie, if you could pop the link to the story map in the chat, for those of you who want to take a look at the story map, because sort of like streaming issues through Zoom, I can't walk you through it live, but we're placing the link to it in the chat. So you're welcome to go ahead and open up a browser and load it on your own machine while I walk through some slides of screenshots to show you what the story map product is. So the story map distills the components of the final report to help folks understand Columbia's future vulnerability. And it initially walks through the background, planning process, results, and next steps, sort of a more detailed explanation of what this talk just was. And it talks through all the different hazards. Viewers can take a look at that flood modeling that Katie described and compare the current FEMA identified flood hazards with our planning level future flood risk areas using a slider map. And you can slide the map from left to right in order to see the FEMA extents versus our future extents. And there's also information on depths. If you want to click on the circle in the left-hand side of the map, that'll bring up the legend.
And Necolle, one thing I apologize, I did forget to mention on the previous slide, just as people are maybe toggling back and forth between the two, you will notice there are a few areas potentially where you'll see almost ponding that's further away from the riverine areas. I just want to highlight again, I talked to that we didn't include drainage systems in this level of the model. So a lot of that water would be accounted for with the local drainage system. So again, just wanted to mention that. So,
For example, then, so if we saw maybe some light blue areas that would indicate water sort of distant from a flooding source like a stream, we could likely conclude that, like, okay, this was a planning level model. We're seeing that water in the model, but our storm drains would take care of that in the event of rain.
Correct. Yeah. And so in this model, it's going to capture any pooling, any depressions. But again, exactly, especially where you're seeing the light blue, you can assume it's a safe assumption that much of that would be accounted for by the local drainage.
So to show some information on extreme heat, we pulled in one of NOAA's tools into our story map, and they have future temperature predictions. So the tool that we incorporated allows a search by address function that will zoom you into your area, and that'll show you how many days above 95 degrees have occurred annually in that area in the past and up till now. And then it makes a prediction of how many days will be above 95 degrees through the end of the century. We also included the CDC data overlaid over the community. So you could see how the CDC has determined that vulnerable populations are distributed throughout Colombia. And the darker areas are the areas of highest social vulnerability. If you look at the screenshot here, you can see there's a couple of census tracts in Harper's Choice that are identified as our highest socially vulnerable population areas. So continuing through the story map, viewers can scroll to a map that shows all of the evaluated assets and their hazard rankings. So this includes future risk from increased precipitation and increased temperature. So it takes a little while to sort of like look at the legend and just kind of focus in on like, what are all these colors telling us? So the diamonds are telling you what's going on with the increased temperature, and the circles are telling you what's going on with the increased precipitation, and the colors indicate low, medium, and high. So then when you go over to the map, you can look at that symbology to kind of understand which sets of assets have low, medium, or high, low, medium, or high for flooding and for extreme temperature. And if you scroll a little further, like seeing all these assets on the Columbia map is interesting, but like that's a lot. It's 550, I think we said over 550, I think it's 553 maybe to be exact. So if you want to understand like what's going on with the assets in a particular village, you can zoom into your village, and then you can toggle through the different assets by type by clicking on those different asset types, and that'll isolate the types of assets that you chose, so you can look at those as a set. And then if you really want to dive into like, well, how did they come up with this ranking? Then you can click on the individual asset, and that GIS data that's in the background will pop up and give you more detailed information about that specific asset. And then if you continue to scroll through the story map, it gives you more information on potential funding sources and some of CA's plans for future engagement. So in a nutshell, I know doing this project was just interesting on a professional level because, you know, climate change is here and being able to take all this existing data and turn it into a planning product for any community is a very worthwhile effort. The fact that I got to work on my own community really just was fascinating. And I'm sure Mike and Katie can attest to, they know Columbia inside and out now. We couldn't have a meeting about this project with me not talking about the village centers or the tot lots or the pathways or all the wonderful things about Columbia. And yeah, it was just a real privilege to be able to work on this project.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Necolle, Michael, and Katie for that presentation. That was really, really helpful. And I'm really just excited about this web-based tool that you all have developed. And I'm sure folks are already starting to fiddle with it. So that's great. I just wanted to kind of give a brief overview of what our team is currently looking at, what we're thinking as far as some possible next steps. And then I think after that, we'll open it up for questions and answers. But right now, our team's current plan is to do some follow-on work to build on this Geographic Information System tool, GIS tool, that Necolle just presented. Our aim is to start with Wild Lake Village. So if you are a resident or a stakeholder in the Wild Lake Village area, we would very much welcome and appreciate your participation. What we're looking to do is initiate this next step as early as Saturday, March the 5th in the afternoon. We are hoping to be able to do an in-person gathering with proper social distancing if the Omicron situation improves enough by then. So we'll provide additional details later on about the exact venue and time, but we're looking at the afternoon, probably between 2 and 5 in the afternoon. But the idea we have is really to pull folks together from the community because we want this to be a people-focused process when we're looking at the village level now. Because what we've seen right now is this broad analysis overarching for Columbia writ large that Michael Baker International has done. And obviously because of CA's nature and all of the assets that CA has to manage, it's appropriate that it's looking at that kind of infrastructure. We as a committee also want to be looking at the social dimension and the community aspect of this as well in a little bit more detail. Our work really has to be community driven. And so our committee is here to facilitate. We're not here to drive. We want to engage in a dialogue with folks in the community on what they're experiencing and what they're concerned about. And maybe with folks from the Wild Lake area, we can fill in some of the data gaps or knowledge gaps on things that may not show up in a geographic information system. You know, when you're looking at the existing data sets and whatnot, there may be some things happening that residents are aware of that don't quite show up on a map that we want to be able to pinpoint and maybe zero in on if there are some potential areas of concern. So that process could further inform the future work of the committee and CA staff, and it can inform the recommendations that we might look to take forward to the board for further Columbia Association action, or perhaps recommendations to other bodies as appropriate for actions that might be appropriate for them to take to help make the community more resilient. So like I said, we want to ensure this is a community-driven thing, that it's a community-driven vision that's at the core of resilience planning. And our hope also is that this might help to inspire a sense of possibility and empowerment that strengthens support for climate action efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change, both at the individual and the community level. We also hope that this process that we'll engage in with Wild Lake might serve as a prototype for other villages to emulate if they so choose. Or if another village wants to pursue their own process, we hope that this story map will provide a useful starting point for those kinds of efforts. And part of the idea also behind this CVA effort was to foster greater awareness and consideration of these challenges by the broader community here in Howard County and beyond. So that's really because a lot of the discussion around climate resilience and adaptation typically revolves around low-lying communities and coastal areas. But as we saw just a few years ago nearby in Ellicott City, inland communities are also vulnerable to the risks posed by climate change. So it's really important that we look for ways to make our infrastructure and our communities more resilient. And while I can't speak for the county, we do understand that they are looking closely at adaptation and resilience issues in conjunction with their planned update of the county's 2015 Climate Action Plan. So our hope is that this CVA effort here in Columbia might help to inform that process, since we ultimately do need to see broader, more holistic approaches taken to these challenges. And finally, our committee is really interested in your feedback on ways that we can help in strengthening community awareness and action on the climate crisis. So in the coming days, please do be on the lookout for follow-up questionnaires that we plan to send to those who are registered for the program tonight. So you'll see a questionnaire coming from us, and we're going to be looking for that kind of feedback to help guide the work that we're going to be doing in the coming months and years. So with that, I'm really happy to open it up to questions and hopefully some answers.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Nicole and Mike and Katie and Tim as well. I just want to just give a quick sort of review of the Q&A. So I've been sort of answering the simple questions in real time as they've come in that were fairly straightforward for me just to hit right back. Let's see. So again, this is our Q&A session. So now is the time to drop in any specific questions folks might have within that tool. I will do my best to handle them. Katie, there's one I think maybe you could handle that we can answer live here. You use an existing FEMA flood map. Most of these maps are out of date. Modeling is only as good as your baseline data.
Correct.
NOAA does rainfall estimates using Atlas 14. When was the last time FEMA incorporated Atlas 14 in its precipitation flood maps for Maryland? The last rainfall estimates that I'm aware of for Maryland date back to 2006.
So I absolutely agree. Many FEMA flood maps are out of date, which is what we found when we were reviewing them. And actually, I think, Nicole, we had some discussions. They are in the process of being updated right now.
Yeah, Howard County has a flood insurance study going right now. They're updating their flood maps and they should be updated mid 2020s. And they're doing that in coordination with the Maryland Department of the Environment.
But yes, I absolutely agree that the models are only going to be as accurate as the information we have and the most current data we had. You know, we got the most current LIDAR data that we could, DEM data, so that's your topography data, land use data that we had. We used the NOAA Atlas 14, and I did see one of the questions, it looks like Jeremy did answer. You know, we did utilize the NOAA Atlas 14 data, and we actually, we evaluated a few different changes in precipitation, but we ended up going with the 30% increase in precipitation, which is tied to a late 21st century scenario. I don't know if that hopefully answers the question.
Great, thank you, Katie. Let's see, what other questions did we come in? I can just sort of review them perhaps. So we will be making all of this information available publicly. We're currently recording this presentation and that'll be a part of our ongoing outreach efforts into the community is leveraging this particular webinar. A couple questions have come in about the inclusion of future development in the study, specifically looking at sort of runoff rates from the impervious surface area, as well as implications associated with increasing heat island from the development. We did not include that. That was sort of another level up in complexity for this simulation that we weren't at that stage to be able to execute. That is something we will sort of consider for follow-on consideration is development, perhaps in sort of localized sort of neighborhood or town center development specifically, perhaps with changes in conditions for the physical environment were not included. It was enough to include the changes in the weather patterns, let alone the physical environment that we were mapping. Let's see what else. We got some other open questions here. Let's see, Mike, perhaps you can handle this one from Mr. Plouffe. Can you provide an example of a vulnerable asset and why is it vulnerable and how might its risk be mitigated?
Sure. So if you look at the list of assets, and this is, you know, specific to the climate impacts, but there's a similar exercise that the county is going through now through the update or the hazard mitigation plan, you know, the state update as well. But if you look at an asset such, and I'll just, you know, use a very simple example of a roadway with extreme temperatures such as, you know, high heat, that's going to impact, you know, maintenance operations, paving, the lifespan of, you know, the asphalt. So those are kind of impacts that you could monetize over time, especially, you know, that's a physical infrastructure asset, but then there's nature-based assets and ecosystem services. You know, we've done more complex analyses, you know, in terms of climate vulnerability, but the scope of this vulnerability assessment, we kept it more of a qualitative level. I know there's a question here of defining the meaning of high, medium, and low. I think we define that a little further in the actual report, but My memory's a little foggy on that. I know that was the matrix that we showed on the slide. But again, we kept it high level for the purposes of this because you do need some of those metrics to really kind of go deeper, especially if you're trying to look at the financial aspect of impacts.
And also, if I could just add to, for example, like that high, medium, and low, it was all relative. The project didn't include like getting specific data on the specific assets, like which bridges and tot lots are, what their ages were, or you know, specific survey information about the structure. So we simply like took the point location that we were provided for the asset and then compared it to the flooding information that we had, some basic assumptions about exposure to heat, whether it served a vulnerable population and whether it served an emergency need, and then whether it had had a flood complaint in the past. So it was sort of like taking all those bits and pieces together, putting them in the matrix, and then getting high, medium, and low relative to that as an output. And there was something, if you don't mind me, Jeremy, just jumping in about the social vulnerability component that I think we meant to mention earlier in the presentation and didn't, but I see the question from a Harper's Choice board member that jogged my memory. So that social vulnerability component is what drove all of the high heat results. So when you look at the assets in the areas of Harper's Choice that are identified as being at high risk for heat, that's because those assets are serving a vulnerable population as identified by the CDC. And the assumption there was that it would be that would be the driving component to why that is a high risk asset.
Okay, and thank you, Necolle, for elaborating further on the vulnerable population aspect. Let's see, one here. Does the level of risk change depending on the amount of climate change that occurs and is this indicated in the report? Katie or Mike, do you want to handle that real quick? It's probably simple.
And just to clarify the climate change, we did only look at the climate impacts of increased precipitation, flooding, and extreme heat. So I know we can definitely answer that related to the precipitation. Katie, if you want to handle that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, it's a very good point. I mean, if you're looking at, you know, specifically when we're looking at increases in precipitation, one of the main things you're looking at is your emissions and what does your emission data look like. And so what we saw was for Maryland, you know, again, the general range based on the emission scenarios is the central emission scenario. You know, we were seeing anywhere from say about a 15 to 30% increase in precipitation by the end of the 21st century. We actually did run the flood models for a 10, 20, and 30% increase in precipitation. And we were actually quite surprised that while the models were different, they weren't as different as we expected them to be. And you know, in digging a little bit deeper into the topography, it does make sense. So much of Columbia is very channelized that, you know, yes, there was some variation between the different levels of precipitation. It wasn't as different as we thought it was going to be. And that's, again, why we decided to go with the 30% and is at least what we are presenting at the moment. But yes, there could be some variation, but it wasn't as much as we would have expected.
Let's see another one here. The asset list for Harper's Choice. Yes, we can absolutely make that list available for any interested parties, especially those in Harper's Choice. Let's see. Do we have a list of the top 5 or 10 biggest next steps that CA wants to take with this information? The storyboard only says you look into funding and provide outreach. How you incorporate this research so as to avoid having it be another plan gathering dust on the shelf. Ooh, fantastic question. Anonymous attendee, kudos. So I can handle this one sort of off the bat, being CA staffer on point for it. So Fortunately here in the community operations department, we work really closely, or at least the sustainability division works really closely with capital improvements as well as open space. So I've already been interfacing with leads within those departments who are directly responsible for the tot lots, who maintain the bridges, who maintain the pathways. I fortunately work, directly within the facilities primarily and managing energy use within the club. So we are already looking at what those next steps might be. And that's sort of the key output of this work is a decision support tool. How do we inform our management and long-term stewardship of our resources, and what immediate steps can we take now? So we are constantly working on repair and rehab of this community all the time. There are the list, the planning that goes on within this organization is tremendous. And our capital improvements division has plans for every bridge going out 5-10 years of when it's going to be replaced. So we are ideally suited to begin to make subtle adjustments in how we take care of our resources as a result of this study. So now we know where we can focus. Okay, so if we're going to start looking at how do we make our bridges more resilient or our tot lots more resilient, where can we do some of that work? Okay, we have this study. Here are the high risk ones. This is where we go to invest in those resources. How does that map with planned replacement schedules for our assets? Can we relocate a pathway 5 or 10 feet, gain a little bit of elevation and put it less at risk? Can we shift the location of a tot lot perhaps back up a hill, again, adjust the elevation a little bit, get out of the projected flood reach. The same for our bridges. Can we, and this is ongoing, we lose bridges fairly regularly. The biggest one we lost was at Fairway Hills Golf course, when we lost this massive span that was out for a long time as a result of the tremendous floods in 2019, I think was the first one. But can we modify our designs slightly to give them 6 inches more height, for example, little subtle changes to make them more resilient in the face of climate change. So those are just a few of the quick steps that we're already looking at making as an organization, as a steward of our resources as a result of this study. Done. Let's see, as part of the evaluation, did Baker evaluate the impact of increased precipitation rates like we have seen just before and during the recent Ellicott City floods? Katie, you're the go-to on that one.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so for the purpose of this study, we did stick with the standard, we were looking at the 100 or 1% annual chance flood, 24-hour event. We didn't look at any increased frequency of such events at the time. It's not to say we can't in the future. The models themselves, we can also look at different types of precipitation events. So if we wanted to look at those shorter duration, flashier, more intense events and see what that looks like, we can. And that's actually something that could be done fairly easily. But again, for the purpose of this study, just because that 1% storm is really kind of the go-to, we decided to stick with that for the time being.
Okay. Well, that's all of our open questions that we have received so far. Let me do a quick scan to make sure there's something that, and my co-panelists, if there's something that you see that's jumping out in the Q&A, feel free to surface it now if I'm not catching it, or if there's other points that you feel that were missed or some additional color you would like to add to the discussion so far.
I'd just like to add, Michael Baker does have internships.
Yeah, and I just want to add that, again, thank you for having us be a part of the project. It's been a really great project to be a part of. And Jeremy, you've been fantastic to work with. So.
Oh, thanks. I get you.
Jeremy, I wanted to add, you answered the question beautifully, but I was going to just tag on a little bit about what CA is doing. And I think a lot of what you answered captured it. But I certainly want to echo that from both, a leadership level from the staff side, as well as Tim mentioned, in his opening comments, a lot of support from the board as well. I think that the idea of how we're incrementally changing our processes, our systems, and a lot of my interest certainly in considering innovation as continuous improvement really speaks to resiliency ultimately. So I think it was Necolle in her opening comments made the comment that we are founded on inclusion. And I think that it's very important that this is absolutely an element and we see it as such. So I just want to make clear to all the participants that we don't see this idea of climate vulnerability as living in a separate place in a technical team in a department somewhere. This is something that is now very much cross-informing multiple work streams, as Jeremy gave several examples of in community operations, but it really is even changing how we consider vendor acquisition and how we consider how we're tracking our finances and how we're considering our budget. So there's lots of ramifications, and the cross-functionality and really driving collaboration and really getting this kind of valuable information out of silos and across the organization. And as Tim alluded to, out ultimately into the community. I hope everyone that is here tonight really finds a role to engage as a volunteer, as an ambassador, as just an informed citizen that can speak into multiple kinds of regulatory, government, and CA processes. We welcome that engagement. I see this as a valuable tool we'll be using as a touchstone for many years to come. So just wanted to kind of add more flavor to very specific examples and say that I think it really is an ethos proposition for us, and just want to confirm that that's how we're looking at it. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Lakey. Let's see, a couple more questions are trickling in here. Does CA intend to do any upcoming assessments to address some of these other concerns? I will say yes, that would be something we're coming in, we're continuing to discuss now that we've completed this sort of first phase of the work, is what are some of the refinements, what are some of the other priorities or gaps in our finding that we need to look at and are worth taking some further steps to elaborate on this research. Can we make the model, can we adjust the model differently in some ways? Are there some aspects or layers that we can, that's the wonderful thing about what we've created within GIS, is now we have sort of the foundation of a tool to apply other layers of assessment upon, because we have this geospatial capacity, which is tremendous for linking issues and concerns and problems and aspects with impacts. So I think this is sort of just the start of an ongoing effort to improve the resilience and sort of long-term sustainability of Columbia.
Jeremy, if I could interject about the story map too. The story map is a great product that is public facing for community consumption. So it's written in plain language and it is a great tool, but it is not the full, robust technical report that was provided to CA, and it doesn't include all of the GIS capability that CA has to make their internal decisions with the transfer of all the data that went into it. So the story map is kind of like the icing on top, because everybody can like sort of read through it and understand it, but there is a lot more robust technical information available to CA as a result of this effort.
Great.
Could I just
Thanks,
add
Nicole.
also, I'm sorry, if I could just add as well, hearkening back to the question about, not wanting this to just be something that gathers dust on the shelf. And that was certainly the idea and the intention that we had on the Climate Change and Sustainability Advisory Committee, and I think with CA staff, that we wanted this process to be a living, breathing process, which is why we want to take it forward. We wanted to have a web-based tool that can be used in the community, where we can drill down more and more to the community level, at the village level and so on. So, we're real excited about this product and look forward to putting it to further good use.
Great, thank you, Tim. And let's see, one more. What suggestions does Michael Baker have for Columbia's villages and citizens as follow-up with the CBA?
Well, I think a great first step would just to become familiar with the product itself. Read through the story map, look through the assets, see if anything surprises you or if anything just sort of confirms what you suspected, and then, work within, the community committees to address that information. I mean, one of the great things, again, that Mike and Katie had to hear me say all the time is what an involved set of community members exist in Columbia, and how in so many villages, the resident and volunteer infrastructure is already in place to solve problems, and people are ready and waiting to be activated. There's Columbia Cares Associations, there's Weed Warrior Associations, there's so many other civic groups that are just plugged into what's going on in this community. I talked about it all the time, like I am now. So I think step one would just be to read through the information, and take it to all those groups, and see where you go from there.
Great, thanks, Nicole. I see you had one comment about as a member of the county's environmental sustainability board, thanking our team for the work. How do you see us working with the board as well as the county moving forward on the county's climate action plan and needing a coordinated effort? So I would agree wholeheartedly. And one of the slides and part of the discussion early on was we've already been actively engaging with the county on multiple touch points. And so, we want to continue that effort. And I know the individuals that we spoke with at the county were sort of anticipating this work product to inform multiple things that they had going on, including the HOCO by design effort. So we plan to interface with the county as many ways as possible to make sure that any benefits are shared throughout the county. Let's see, I see county senior centers were included. Why are they and not other county assets? So that question kind of goes way back to the origins of the entire project. I think we had limited geospatial data to start with from the county, and I think we're trying to grab what things we could or already had that were publicly available. So I think it was just a matter of it being a little bit outside of our scope in focusing on Columbia's assets, and that was sort of enough of a barrel to get our arms around. I don't have a specific recollection as to why we were able to get the senior centers included, but not others. Nicole, do you have a thought on that?
I do, yeah. So for the assets, we included assets that were CA owned or maintained. So that was like our tier 1 set of assets, and CA had the GIS available for those assets of point locations and stuff like that. When we, talked a little bit more about the project, and we decided to include a socially vulnerable population component to it, we recommended that we added, like, as a subset of assets that age-restricted housing, assisted living and long-term care facilities, and shelters and Red Cross facilities. And that's where that county component came in. And again, that was kind of limited to what we had readily available. So it was an addition of the social vulnerable population component.
Got it. And we have some cheerleading from some Wild Lake folks about upcoming engagement and collaboration. Thanks, Kevin. And I am seeing no more questions coming in. Let's see, do we have any final thoughts? We're at the 8 o'clock hour, so we've hit our an hour mark. Any final thoughts from the panels, or Lakey, would you like to add anything here at the end?
I don't think so. I'll just, finalize with the thank you to the consultant team, but again, the sustainability team and the work and support of the advisory committee. I think a lot of the indications at the beginning of the board support and the staff support to move this forward. I too am excited about the comments about where can the partnerships happen. So we are absolutely open to that and want to find ways to move that forward, and are doing a lot more engagement. So I think having this kind of come out at this timing is an exciting time, because we're kind of making a pivot at CA to try and earnestly and intentionally do more of that work in a deliberate way. So I think we're going to get a lot of resource out of this material. And as Tim indicated, I think the format of it is also an indicator of where at CA we're trying to go with having it easily accessible and easy to understand. So thanks for your hard work. I'll just say, and final, Jeremy, we really appreciate your team and the work that you've done for CA and leading the project. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I stand on the shoulders of giants, really. And it's the board and you, Lakey, as well, providing the support to continue to do this great work. So I'm going to include it because I am curious about it too. Anybody have any thoughts from the Michael Baker team on harmful algal blooms? Going once? Twice? Michael, any harmful algal bloom comments before we close?
I'd love to talk about it more, but unfortunately it just was outside the scope that we looked at. So, but we can definitely continue that conversation.
Okay.
We have many subject matter experts at Michael Baker.
Well, that might be perhaps one of the ones we decide to focus on going forward, giving our lake and pond responsibilities, that we have so many of them in the community.
Mhm.
Okay, well, I think that concludes our webinar on CA's climate vulnerability assessment. I would like to thank this entire team who is here now, Michael, Necolle, Katie, Tim, and the Climate Change and Sustainability Advisory Committee, Lakey, for your support and leadership. Sam, who's tech support on here. This wouldn't have happened without the man behind the curtain making it happen and keeping us on a level plane from a technology perspective, and the CA board as well for their leadership. So I have posted an email that goes to me if there are any future questions. And again, we have recorded this and we'll be making all this information publicly available for use. So thank you all. And have a great evening.
Thank you all.